My parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with one warning taped to the pristine silver paper: "Do not make a scene." Then they drove off. I opened it and nearly dropped to my knees right there on the front porch. Trembling, I dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped inside, saw two uniformed officers standing in our living room, and turned pale. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," he whispered, dropping his briefcase heavily onto the hardwood floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your own blood relatives try to destroy your life just to protect their golden child. The officers, Officer Reynolds and Officer Jenkins, were standing by our kitchen island, their expressions grave as they examined the contents of the silver box. My mother, Vivian, was a woman obsessed with appearances, so of course her attempt at federal extortion arrived wrapped in high-end paper with a perfectly tied silk bow. But what lay inside was anything but elegant. Spread across the marble counter was a stolen external hard drive alongside a thick stack of printed financial ledgers. I had recognized the heavy cardstock and the embossed logo immediately. It belonged to Desmond Logistics, the highly lucrative shipping and freight firm my father had built from the ground up in Atlanta. But the numbers printed on these specific pages were completely fabricated. They were meticulously doctored ledgers manipulated to look like my husband Jamal had been siphoning corporate funds into hidden offshore accounts. Sitting right on top of the fake bank statements was a handwritten note from my mother. The cursive handwriting was elegant and terrifyingly cold. "Sign over your 10% grandfathered trust shares to Chloe or Jamal, goes to federal prison. Do not make a scene. Family helps family." Officer Reynolds pulled out a notepad, his eyes shifting from the forged documents to my face. "Who exactly delivered this package to your home, Mrs. Williams?" I did not have to guess, and I certainly did not have to cover for them. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened our home security application. "I can show you exactly who did it," I said, my voice steadying as the initial paralyzing shock began to morph into a cold, unbreakable anger. I pressed play on the high-definition doorbell camera footage and slid the phone across the island toward the two officers. The video was undeniably clear. My father, Desmond, stepped out of his black luxury sedan wearing his custom-tailored golf polo and slacks. He walked up our driveway with that same arrogant, heavy-footed stride he used when commanding a boardroom or holding court at the country club. He placed the silver box on the welcome mat, adjusted his gold watch, and looked directly into the camera lens with a dismissive smirk. He did not look like a man committing a felony. He looked like a man taking out the trash. He turned his back and walked away without a second glance. Jamal stared at the screen over the officer's shoulder, his hands gripping the edge of the kitchen island until his knuckles turned ashen. 10 years, Jamal said, his voice vibrating with a mixture of profound disbelief and raw rage. 10 years I have sat at their dinner table. I have fixed their home networks. I have smiled and kept my mouth shut while they treated you like the hired help and looked at me like I was not good enough for their family. And now they are trying to frame me to pay off Trent and Chloe's debts." Officer Jenkins looked up from the notebook. "Who is Trent?" I took a deep breath, looking down at the forged documents that were designed to obliterate our peaceful life. "Trent is my brother-in-law," I explained, keeping my tone strictly factual to avoid letting the emotions overwhelm me. "He is a white investment broker operating out of New York, who married my older sister Chloe. In my parents' eyes, Chloe is the absolute pinnacle of success and the sole inheritor of the family legacy. She is the vice president of the local charity league, and Trent is the golden son-in-law bringing corporate prestige and white-collar validation to the family name." Jamal stepped forward, picking up one of the forged ledger pages with a shaking hand, careful to hold it only by the very edge. "What they do not advertise at their high society country club galas," Jamal told the officers, "is that Trent is bleeding them completely dry. He mismanaged over $500,000 of the family company's funds on terrible unauthorized trades. They have an external independent audit coming up next month. If these missing funds are discovered during that audit, Trent loses his broker license, faces massive fines, and likely goes to federal prison for embezzlement. Officer Reynolds connected the dots instantly, his pen pausing on the notepad. So instead of holding Trent accountable for the missing funds, they are trying to pin the embezzlement on you. Exactly, I replied, crossing my arms defensively. My father and my mother care about one thing above all else. They are obsessed with projecting Black excellence, or at least their heavily curated illusion of it. Admitting that their perfect, wealthy white son-in-law defrauded their logistics company would absolutely destroy their social standing in Atlanta. They would be the laughingstock of their elite circles, but framing their Black son-in-law, the one married to the daughter they have always viewed as a massive disappointment that solves their problem cleanly. I paced the length of the kitchen, the reality of my family's betrayal settling into my bones. They look at me, and they just see an expendable resource. I continued. I work in the IT sector. To them, I am just the girl who fixes computers, manages maintenance requests, and wastes her potential. They think I am weak. They think I am too afraid to ever fight back against their authority. The note explicitly demands my grandfather trust shares. My grandfather left me 10% equity in the family logistics firm before he passed away. If I sign those shares over to Chloe today, my parents can liquidate them to cover Trent's stolen funds before the auditors ever arrive. They honestly thought placing a box of forged federal crimes on my doorstep would terrify me into immediate compliance. Officer Reynolds examined the hard drive and the attached extortion letter, carefully, his expression hardening. Mrs. Williams. Mr. Williams, you need to understand the absolute gravity of what we are looking at right here. This is not just a messy family dispute or a simple blackmail case. Because this involves threatening to file a false federal crime report utilizing forged corporate financial documents and making an extortion demand that involves covering for a broker operating out of New York, this crosses state lines. This is a federal extortion matter, Officer Jenkins added gravely, stepping back from the counter. We have to escalate this to the FBI field office immediately. Your father just committed a major federal offense the moment he left this package on your property. Jamal exhaled sharply, running a heavy hand over his face. The fear in his posture was palpable. If they send these forged ledgers to the IRS or the Securities and Exchange Commission, my career is completely over. Even if we prove they are fake eventually, the investigation alone would destroy my professional reputation. My firm would suspend me immediately pending the results. They know exactly what they are doing. They are trying to back us into a corner where we have absolutely no choice but to sign away your equity just to save my freedom. I looked at Jamal, seeing the genuine raw terror in the eyes of the man who had loved and supported me through years of my family's toxic, dismissive behavior. He had always been my anchor when my mother made snide comments about my natural hair or my modest car. He had held me when my father conveniently forgot to invite us to family vacations. Then I looked back down at the handwritten note from my mother. Do not make a scene. Family helps family. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the manipulation burned away any lingering loyalty I held for the people who had raised me. The invisible tether of familial obligations snapped, replaced by an absolute icy clarity. They had finally crossed the line of no return, and they had severely underestimated who they were dealing with. I turned back to the officers, my posture straightening, my voice dropping to a cold, unwavering register. Officers, I said, looking directly into Officer Reynolds' eyes. I do not just want to file a standard police report. I do not want to just hand this evidence over to the FBI and wait for a long, drawn-out investigation while my family continues to threaten my husband's livelihood and freedom. Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in my demeanor. What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Williams? They want me to comply, I said, a very specific, devastating plan already forming perfectly in my mind. They expect me to be the submissive, terrified daughter they have always conditioned me to be. I am going to give them exactly what they want. I want to set a wiretap. 72 hours earlier, the air inside my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate was thick enough to choke on. From the outside, Desmond and Vivian projected the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. Their manicured lawns, the imported Romar Bearden prints hanging in the foyer, the pristine luxury sedans parked in the circular driveway. It was a flawless, carefully curated performance designed for the high society circles they desperately clung to. But behind closed mahogany doors, the reality of our family dynamic was profoundly toxic. We were gathered at the formal dining room for our mandatory Sunday dinner, but the catered soul food sat untouched, growing cold on bone china plates. Trent, my sister Chloe's husband, was pacing the length of the hand-woven Persian rug. Sweat glistened on his forehead and his knuckles were white around a crystal tumbler of my father's 20-year-old reserve bourbon. Trent was a man who usually oozed the smug, effortless confidence of a privileged Wall Street broker. But tonight he looked like a cornered animal. Chloe sat at the table dabbing perfectly curated tears from her eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of the tragic victim to absolute perfection. The crisis had just been laid bare on the table. Trent had mismanaged $500,000 of Desmond Logistics operating capital. He had bypassed the corporate safeguards, funneled the cash into aggressive, unauthorized offshore trades, and lost every single cent. Now an external federal audit was scheduled for next week. If the missing funds were not replaced immediately, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the IRS would dismantle the entire family legacy. Trent would lose his broker license and go to federal prison. My father did not yell at Trent. He did not reprimand the man who had just stolen $500,000 from his life's work. Instead, Desmond sat at the head of the table, steepled his fingers, and turned his cold, calculating gaze directly toward me and Jamal. "Maya, you and Jamal need to sign over your trust equity to Chloe tonight," my father demanded, his voice carrying that heavy, authoritative tone that brooked absolutely no defiance. "We will liquidate your 10% grandfathered shares tomorrow morning. It will cover the deficit before the auditors arrive, and we can quietly sweep this under the rug." I stared at the man who had raised me, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I am sorry," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Your white son-in-law just embezzled $500,000 from your company, and your solution is to bankrupt me and my husband to cover his federal crimes." Trent stopped pacing and glared at me. "It was a market fluctuation, Maya, a calculated risk that took a bad bounce. Do not act like you understand high-level finance." My father slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table, making the crystal glasses rattle. "Trent made a mistake," he boomed, his eyes narrowing at me with profound disgust. "But he is the vice president of this company. He brings prestige to this family. You just fix computers for a living. You sit in a cubicle resetting passwords and routing maintenance tickets. You and Jamal live in a gentrifying neighborhood in a house you do not even need. Sign the papers, Maya. Be useful to this family for once in your life." The blatant disrespect hit me like a physical blow, though it was nothing new. For 33 years, I had been the designated scapegoat. I was the dark-skinned daughter with natural hair who preferred coding in the shadows to parading around country club galas. Chloe was the light-skinned golden child, the pageant winner, the face of the Heritage Charity League. In their eyes, my only purpose was to serve as a stepping stone for her continued elevation. "I am not signing anything," I stated flatly, locking eyes with my father. "You are not touching my grandfather's trust. You want to save Trent, sell one of your luxury cars. Better yet, let him face the consequences of his actions." My mother, Vivian, adjusted her silk wrap, her face contorting into a familiar mask of disappointed superiority. "You have always been so utterly selfish," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You have been jealous of your sister since the day she was born. Chloe has a reputation to uphold. She is a pillar of this community. What do you have? A mediocre IT job and a stubborn attitude. We ask for one simple sacrifice to save this family from public ruin, and you sit there clutching your little shares out of pure spite." Jamal stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His jaw was clenched tight, the muscles jumping as he looked at my parents. "Do not speak to my wife like that," Jamal warned, his voice low and firm. "She does not owe you her financial security because your golden boy got caught stealing. We are leaving." I stood up beside him, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. The audacity of the demand was suffocating, but the way they rallied to protect Trent while treating Jamal and me like expendable collateral was a betrayal I could no longer swallow. As we turned our backs and walked toward the grand foyer, the illusion of Trent's polished corporate manners completely shattered. He stormed out of the dining room, his face flushed red with bourbon and panic. "You will regret this, Maya," Trent yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You think you can just walk away and let me go down for this? I know how to make people pay. I will ruin you both." I did not look back. Jamal opened the heavy mahogany front door, and we walked out into the cool Atlanta night, leaving them to their panic and their crumbling facade. I thought that was the end of it. I thought they would simply sell off some assets, resent me forever, and move on. I was wrong. Standing in my kitchen 3 days later, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers reflecting off my living room walls, the true depth of their depravity snapped into horrific focus. I looked down at the forged financial ledgers spread across my kitchen island. I looked at the stolen hard drive that my father had casually dropped on my welcome mat. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Trent did not just forge a few signatures. He had weaponized his corporate access to completely rewrite the digital history of Desmond Logistics. I leaned over the documents, tracing the IP addresses and transfer codes printed on the fraudulent bank statements. My breath caught in my throat. Trent had not just tried to steal my shares through extortion. He had used Jamal's remote login credentials. He had routed the stolen $500,000 through dummy accounts tied directly to Jamal's name. In his desperation to avoid federal prison, Trent had intentionally manufactured an entire digital paper trail to ensure a hard-working, innocent black man took the fall for a wealthy white executive's crimes. And my parents, obsessed with protecting Chloe's high society, marriage had fully co-signed the frame job. They had hand-delivered the evidence to my door to force my submission. I looked up from the papers, meeting Jamal's terrified, betrayed eyes, and then I looked at Officer Reynolds. The time for playing the quiet, disappointing daughter was officially over. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing us inside the sudden, suffocating silence of our own home. The red and blue flashes of the police cruisers slowly faded through the living room windows as Officer Reynolds and Officer Jenkins backed out of our driveway, taking the silver box of forged documents with them. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Jamal broke. He began pacing the length of the kitchen, his dress shoes striking the hardwood floor in a frantic, erratic rhythm. He ran both hands over his closely cropped hair, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted a marathon. He was a brilliant financial analyst, a man who built his career on meticulous compliance and unshakable ethics. And now he was staring down the barrel of a fabricated federal indictment. "They are going to ruin me, Maya," Jamal said, his voice raw and trembling. "Even if the FBI realizes those ledgers are fake, the investigation alone will trigger an automatic suspension at my firm. My clients will flee. My reputation will be completely incinerated." Trent knows exactly how the financial sector works. He knows the mere suspicion of embezzlement is a death sentence for my career. I watched my husband, the man who had worked 12-hour days to pay off my student loans, the man who held my hand through every toxic holiday dinner unraveling before my eyes. The sight of his fear burned away the last lingering shreds of daughterly obligation I possessed. My father and my sister had declared war, assuming I was completely unarmed. It was time to show them my arsenal. I did not try to offer him empty platitudes. Instead, I turned away from the kitchen island and walked toward the walk-in pantry. Hidden behind a false panel at the back of the shelving unit was a heavy steel wall safe. I punched in the 12-digit alphanumeric code, the mechanical locks clicking heavily into place before the solid door swung open. I reached inside, bypassing the emergency cash and our passports, and pulled out a thick black leather binder. It was heavy, packed tight, with hundreds of pages of legal documentation and corporate filings. I walked back into the kitchen and dropped the binder onto the marble island. It landed with a solid, echoing thud that made Jamal stop his frantic pacing. He looked at the binder, then up at me, confusion knitting his brow. "What is that, Maya?" he asked, his tone edged with rising panic. "We need to be calling defense attorneys. We need to be pulling our bank records to prove those transactions never happened. Why are you pulling out paperwork? I need you to look at this." I said, my voice eerily calm. I pushed the leather binder across the smooth marble surface until it rested right in front of him. Open it. Jamal stared at me for a long second, trying to read my expression, before reaching out and flipping open the heavy cover. The first page was a certificate of incorporation filed in the state of Delaware. He frowned, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Aegis Protocol, he read aloud, stumbling over the unfamiliar corporate name. A holding company specializing in enterprise cybersecurity and proprietary logistics infrastructure. Maya, what is this? Whose company is this? Turn the page, I instructed softly. He flipped to the next section. These were patent registrations. Highly complex software patents covering global freight tracking algorithms, automated payroll distributions, and encrypted dispatch routing. He read the technical descriptions, his financial background allowing him to quickly grasp the massive scale of the intellectual property outlined on the paper. Then his eyes dropped to the bottom of the page where the sole proprietor and chief executive officer was listed. He stopped breathing. He read the name again. Then he looked up at me, his dark eyes wide with an absolute world-altering shock. Maya Williams, he whispered, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Maya, this says you own all of this. This says you hold the master patents for the dispatch software. I did not blink. I do not just fix computers for a living, Jamal. I have not been a low-level IT worker for a very long time. For the past 7 years, while my parents thought I was rotting away in a cubicle resetting passwords, I was building Aegis Protocol from the ground up. I wrote the foundational code myself. I secured the patents under the holding company to maintain absolute anonymity. Jamal leaned heavily against the counter, shaking his head as if trying to clear a sudden fog. But these patents, he started, his finger tracing the intricate software diagrams. This is the exact architectural framework for the software Desmond Logistics uses. This is the operating system your father runs his entire international shipping empire on. It is, I confirmed, stepping closer to the island. When my father decided to modernize his fleet 5 years ago, he hired an independent tech consulting firm to license the best logistics software on the market. He had absolutely no idea that the consulting firm was a shell company I owned, and he had no idea that the software he was purchasing the rights to use belonged to Aegis Protocol. I am the sole owner of the digital infrastructure that keeps Desmond Logistics breathing. The kitchen fell dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. Jamal stared at me as if he were looking at a stranger, though not with fear, but with a profound, staggering awe. He looked back down at the binder, flipping through pages of quarterly earnings reports that showed profits in the tens of millions. He looked at the licensing agreements my father had unknowingly signed with my corporation. You are a multi-millionaire, Jamal stated, the reality finally anchoring in his mind. You own the digital ground your family walks on. You hold the master keys to their entire empire. He closed the binder slowly, his hands pressing flat against the leather cover. He looked back up at me, his expression shifting from awe to a deep, agonizing confusion. Maya, they humiliated you. They treated you like an absolute peasant at every single Thanksgiving dinner. Your mother mocked your clothes. Your father called you a failure to your face. Trent laughed at your career just 3 days ago. You sat there and took it year after year while you essentially held their entire livelihood in the palm of your hand. Why did you not crush them? Why did you hide this? My chest tightened, a heavy knot of old, unresolved grief rising to my throat. I did not want to crush them, Jamal. I wanted them to love me. I grew up watching what money did to my parents. I watched it turn my father into a ruthless tyrant and my mother into a shallow, status-obsessed shell of a human being. I watched it turn Chloe into an entitled monster who believes other people only exist to serve her needs. I saw how Trent gravitated to Chloe the second he smelled the family wealth. I never wanted people to look at me and just see dollar signs. I reached across the island and gently took his hands in mine. I hid Aegis Protocol because I needed to know if my family could love me for exactly who I was. I needed to know if they could respect the quiet, ordinary daughter without a massive bank account attached to her name. Jamal squeezed my hands, his eyes softening with immediate understanding. And they failed, he said quietly. They failed spectacularly, I agreed, my voice hardening into steel. They proved that their love is entirely conditional. They proved that they view anyone without power as expendable. I kept my secret because I was waiting for them to change, waiting for them to finally see me. But tonight, they crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. They did not just insult me this time. They tried to frame you. They tried to destroy your life and send you to federal prison just to protect a white thief who is actively robbing them blind. They tried to sacrifice my husband. I let go of Jamal's hands and picked up my cell phone from the counter. The tears of disappointment were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating adrenaline. The time for waiting was over. My family only respected brute force and absolute authority, and it was time I spoke to them in the only language they truly understood. "What are you doing?" Jamal asked, watching me scroll through my encrypted contact list. "I am stopping the audit on your life and starting the audit on theirs," I replied. I found the number for my lead corporate attorney, a vicious, highly effective litigator based out of Chicago, who managed all the aggressive contracts for Aegis Protocol. I pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker, setting it down on the marble island so Jamal could hear every word. The phone rang twice before being answered. Marcus, speaking a crisp, professional voice, echoed through the kitchen. "Marcus, it is Maya," I said, leaning over the counter. "I need you to drop whatever you are working on right now. I need an immediate full-scale revocation of the enterprise software license currently held by Desmond Logistics." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line as Marcus processed the command. An immediate revocation, Maya. That will trigger a catastrophic operational failure on their end. Their entire global dispatch system will freeze. We need solid legal grounds to terminate a contract of that magnitude without standard notice. "We have solid grounds," I assured him, my eyes locked on Jamal. Desmond Logistics is currently under investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for corporate extortion, forgery, and wire fraud. That is a direct violation of the morality and criminal conduct clauses embedded in Section 4 of our licensing agreement. Draft the termination papers and execute the server lockout at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do not send a warning. Just pull the plug. "Understood," Marcus replied, the sound of rapid typing already filtering through the speaker. "The servers will go dark at 8 a.m. sharp. I will have the breach of contract notices couriered to their executive offices by 9. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, ending the call. The kitchen was quiet again, but the frantic, panicked energy from earlier was completely gone. Jamal was standing tall, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across his handsome face. He looked at the silver box of forged evidence, then looked at the heavy leather binder representing my digital empire. "My father thought he was so incredibly smart." Dropping that box on my porch, I said, picking up the forged extortion note and tearing it perfectly in half. "He thought he held all the power. Let us see how smug Trent feels about his upcoming federal audit when his entire corporate network goes pitch black." I did not sleep that night. At 7 in the morning, the pristine Atlanta sunlight began to filter through our kitchen windows, illuminating the torn pieces of my mother's extortion letter scattered across the marble island. I picked up my phone and typed a single calculated message to Vivian. "I got the box. Let us meet." Less than a minute later, my screen illuminated with her reply. She sent an address. It was the Oak Creek Country Club, the absolute crown jewel of Atlanta high society, where membership required a 6-figure initiation fee, extensive pedigree reviews, and the right last name. It was a highly deliberate choice on her part. Vivian had always utilized public, highly visible arenas for family discipline. When I was a child, she would wait until we were in a crowded, upscale restaurant or sitting in the front pew of a Sunday church service to whisper her cruelest, most degrading critiques. She knew my paralyzing fear of making a scene would force me to swallow my tears and obey. Today, she was banking on that exact same conditioned silence. She wanted to force my compliance over poached eggs and hollandaise sauce surrounded by her wealthy peers, ensuring I would quietly sign away my livelihood without raising my voice. Jamal drove us to the club in a heavy, focused silence. The massive iron gates of Oak Creek swung open as the valet approached our modest sedan. We walked through the grand lobby past towering oil paintings of founding members and stepped out onto the sweeping stone veranda overlooking the pristine 18th hole. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of expensive floral perfumes and freshly cut grass. I spotted my family immediately. They had claimed a prime, highly visible table near the very edge of the terrace. Desmond, Vivian, Chloe, and Trent. They looked like a magazine advertisement for generational wealth and effortless superiority. My parents wore crisp color-coordinated resort wear. Chloe looked absolutely flawless in a pastel designer sundress, her hair blown out to perfection, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet as she laughed at something my father said. Trent was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the wrought iron backrest, a half-empty mimosa resting near his hand. The frantic, sweating panic from the previous night's Sunday dinner had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sickening, radiant smugness. They were celebrating. They actually believed their amateur extortion plot had worked perfectly. As Jamal and I approached the table, Vivian offered a tight, artificial smile designed strictly for the benefit of the surrounding diners. "Ah, Maya Jamal," she chimed, her voice pitched perfectly for the neighboring tables to hear. "So glad you could join us for brunch on such short notice. Sit down, please." We took our seats. The waiter materialized, instantly poured us ice water, and the exact moment he stepped away, the warm family pleasantries evaporated into thin air. Desmond leaned forward, his forearms resting heavily on the white linen tablecloth. His eyes were cold and sharp, assessing me the exact same way he assessed a failing stock option. "I assume you brought a pen, Maya," my father said, keeping his volume respectfully low, but his tone absolute. Trent did not even wait for me to formulate an answer. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored linen jacket and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. He smoothed it flat against the table and slid it precisely across the white linen until it stopped a mere inch from my water glass. It was a transfer of deed and equity. "Smart girl," Maya, Trent said, flashing a bright, predatory smile that made my stomach turn. "I knew you would see reason once the reality of your situation fully set in. Sign the trust shares over to Chloe right now, and the FBI never sees Jamal's little embezzlement files. We take the shares, we cover the audit deficit before the feds arrive next week, and you two get to walk away without a massive federal indictment. Everyone wins." Chloe took a delicate sip of her freshly squeezed orange juice and sighed, looking at me with an expression of deeply feigned pity. "You really should thank us, Maya. Trent is offering you a tremendous favor. If word got out to the corporate sector that Jamal was stealing from our father, he would never work in the financial industry ever again. We are keeping this quiet. We are keeping it in the family. We are protecting you." The absolute unshakable delusion of my older sister was staggering to witness. She sat there draped in expensive jewelry purchased directly with stolen corporate funds, genuinely believing she was the magnanimous savior of my husband's reputation. They had spent their entire lives twisting reality to suit their immediate needs, convincing themselves that their cruelty was actually a form of grace. I let my shoulders slump forward deliberately, making myself appear small and defeated. I lowered my gaze to the table, forcing my hands to tremble just slightly as I reached out to brush my fingertips against the edge of the transfer document. I needed them to believe they had completely broken my spirit. I needed their massive egos to eclipse any remaining sense of caution. "But Trent," I said, making my voice sound brittle and terrified, "I just do not understand how you did it. How did you get those files onto his computer? Jamal's network is heavily encrypted. He uses a secondary military-grade firewall for his home office. If I sign this paper, I need to know exactly how exposed we are. How exactly did you break into his system to plant those forged ledgers? Vivian shot a nervous, highly irritated glance at the wealthy couple sitting at the table next to us. Keep your voice down, Maya, she hissed through gritted teeth. Do not make a scene. But Trent was far too arrogant to resist a captive audience for his perceived brilliance. The alcohol from the mimosas and the impending victory had loosened his tongue considerably. He leaned across the table, eager to brag about his technological dominance over the black man he had always secretly viewed as his intellectual inferior. It was not that hard, Maya, Trent scoffed, laughing a little under his breath. Jamal thinks he is some sort of cybersecurity genius, but he left a massive backdoor wide open on the company intranet. When he logged into the Desmond Logistics employee portal last week to update your tax forms, I ran a script and captured his active session token. I did not need to hack his home firewall. I just bypassed it entirely by routing the doctored financial ledgers through the company's internal server directly onto his local drive. It was a clean push, untraceable. I looked at my father, keeping my eyes wide with manufactured fear. Dad, you let him use the secure company servers to plant fake evidence on my husband. Desmond sat back, crossing his arms over his broad chest, his expression unyielding and intensely proud of his son-in-law's maneuvering. It is my company, Maya. I have absolute executive override on all internal servers. Trent came to me with a highly creative solution to our temporary liquidity problem, and I authorized the necessary access to ensure the transaction went through smoothly. You left us no choice with your stubborn disrespect last night. Think of it as a necessary strategic corporate maneuver to protect the overall family brand. Jamal was sitting perfectly still beside me, his hands resting on his knees. To my family, he looked like an utterly defeated man facing the total destruction of his hard-earned career. But I knew the subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw meant he was mentally absorbing every single word, cataloging the open admission of guilt. So I clarified, keeping my tone perfectly even and projecting my voice just a fraction louder. Just to be absolutely clear, you, Trenton Davis, admit to manipulating session tokens and bypassing network security to plant forged financial documents. And you, Desmond Williams, admit to using your executive authority to facilitate a cyber intrusion and frame Jamal for your missing funds. Trent rolled his eyes, dramatically drumming his fingers on the pristine tablecloth. Yes, Maya, we did. And there is not a single thing you can do about it, because if you go to the cops, we hit send on the email to the feds, and Jamal is arrested before dinner. Now stop stalling and sign the paper. Vivian tapped her manicured fingernails impatiently against her crystal mimosa glass. We have an 11 o'clock tea time with the board of directors, Maya. Let us wrap this up right now. I did not pick up the pen. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs. The manufactured trembling in my hands ceased entirely. My posture straightened, the fragile facade of the terrified, submissive daughter, melting away completely to reveal the woman who commanded a global technology empire from the shadows. I looked at Trent, then at my father, and then at my mother, absorbing their arrogance one last time. I reached up slowly to the lapel of my tailored emerald blazer. Pinned to the fabric was a heavy vintage silver brooch I had never worn to a family function before. I tapped the center of the silver brooch twice with my index finger. It was not a piece of family jewelry. It was a high-frequency, state-of-the-art hidden microphone currently transmitting a crystal-clear live audio feed directly to Special Agent Harris at the federal field office downtown. I had spent an hour on the phone with him early this morning, arranging the intercept after handing over the physical evidence. He had told me they needed a direct verbal confession of the cyber intrusion to move immediately without a prolonged warrant process. I looked at my family, my voice shedding all pretense of fear, ringing out clear and cold over the crowded country club patio. I just needed to hear you admit it, I said, pushing my chair back and standing up. The silence that followed my declaration hung over our table like a physical weight. My mother blinked, her manicured hand freezing halfway to her mimosa glass. Trent let out a short, dismissive breath, shaking his head as if I had just uttered something entirely incomprehensible. My father simply stared at me, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line, waiting for me to sit back down and resume my role as the obedient, terrified daughter. They honestly believed the game was still theirs to control. They believed my standing up was just a momentary lapse in judgment, a brief spark of rebellion that they could easily extinguish with another threat. I did not sit down. I stood perfectly still, letting the crisp morning air drift across the terrace, carrying the muted sounds of polite country club conversations and the distant clinking of silverware. I watched the absolute certainty radiating from my family, savoring the exact shape of their arrogance. Before Vivian could open her mouth to scold me for causing a scene, the sharp, obnoxious ringtone of Trent's cell phone shattered the quiet elegance of the patio. Trent ignored it, keeping his hostile gaze fixed firmly on Jamal, trying to maintain his posture of dominance. But the phone did not stop. It rang relentlessly, a piercing sound that caused the wealthy couple at the next table to glance over with visible irritation. "Turn that off, Trenton," my father muttered, his eyes never leaving mine. "We are in the middle of a delicate family discussion." Trent reached into his tailored jacket, fully intending to silence the device. But the moment his fingers brushed the fabric, my father's phone erupted. It was a loud, blaring corporate chime that Desmond strictly reserved for emergency dispatch alerts. A split second later, a bright pop melody echoed from Chloe's designer handbag. 3 phones all ringing simultaneously, creating a chaotic symphony of panic right in the middle of the exclusive Oak Creek dining terrace. My father broke first. With an annoyed huff, he pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed it to his ear, fully prepared to fire whichever employee had dared to interrupt his Sunday morning victory lap. Desmond speaking, he barked, his tone dripping with absolute authority. "Make it fast." I watched the exact moment my father's empire began to collapse. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing to witness. The deep, healthy brown of his complexion rapidly faded to a sickly, ashen gray. The rigid, powerful set of his shoulders suddenly collapsed inward. He stopped breathing for a solid 5 seconds. He simply sat there, the phone pressed tightly to his ear, his eyes widening in a state of absolute, unadulterated horror. "What do you mean we are locked out?" my father demanded, his voice suddenly stripping away all of its cultured country club polish. "What do you mean the entire system is down? Reboot the mainframes. Call the enterprise hosting service immediately." Trent had answered his own phone by now, and the panic radiating from him was even more severe. Trent was practically vibrating, pressing a finger into his free ear to block out the ambient noise of the patio. He was stammering, his voice rising in pitch. "The trading portals are frozen. How can the trading portals be frozen? The audit algorithms are running right now. Shut it down. Physically unplug the terminal servers if you have to." Chloe was staring at her screen, her mouth hanging open as a flood of automated crisis alerts began lighting up her notifications. She dropped her phone onto the white tablecloth as if it had burned her. My father was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Listen to me very carefully," he shouted into the receiver, entirely forgetting Vivian's strict rules about public decorum. "You have thousands of freight trucks currently stuck at international border checkpoints. The drivers cannot scan their manifests. The warehouse distribution protocols are completely blind. Our entire supply chain is halted. You tell the network engineers to break the firewall and get my company back online right now, or you are all fired." He lowered the phone, his hand visibly shaking. The absolute devastation in his eyes was something I had never seen before. Desmond Logistics, the multi-million-dollar titan of the southern shipping industry, had just been effectively paralyzed. The trucks could not be dispatched. The automated payroll accounts were entirely frozen. The digital keys to his kingdom had vanished into thin air. Trent slammed his phone down onto the table, shattering the base of his champagne flute. The mimosa spilled across the white linen, soaking into the forged transfer documents he had presented to me just moments ago. Trent was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the table until they landed dead center on my husband. In his blind, desperate panic, Trent's mind leaped to the only conclusion his arrogant worldview would allow. He needed a scapegoat, and he immediately projected his own criminality onto the black man sitting across from him. "It is you!" Trent screamed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Jamal. "You did this! I told you, Desmond. I told you he was a liability. He was angry about the audit and he hacked us." Jamal did not flinch. He sat comfortably in his chair, completely unbothered, sipping his water with a look of profound, undisturbed tranquility. "You malicious thug," Trent continued, his voice echoing across the now completely silent country club patio. "Every single diner was staring at us. You hijacked our central network to hide your own embezzlement. You locked down the corporate servers. You think you can commit a massive cybercrime and just sit there drinking water. I am calling the police right now. I am having you arrested for digital terrorism." Vivian was clutching her pearl necklace, her face flushed with extreme embarrassment, as the surrounding country club members whispered and pointed. "Call security, Desmond," she hissed frantically. "Have this man removed from our table. I knew we never should have let him into this family." My father stood up, towering over the table, his chest heaving with rage. "Turn the servers back on Jamal." He ordered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Turn them back on this second, or I will ensure you never see the outside of a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life." I did not yell. I did not match their frantic, sweating hysteria. I simply reached into my emerald green blazer and opened the small interior pocket. My fingers brushed against the cold, heavy metal waiting inside. I pulled out a single thick business card. It was not made of paper or standard cardstock. It was forged from solid matte black tungsten steel, heavy and unyielding. The edges were polished silver, and dead center, embossed in crisp raised silver lettering, was the crest of Aegis Protocol. Beneath the crest was my name, Maya Williams, Chief Executive Officer. I held the heavy metal card between my index and middle finger, letting it catch the morning sunlight, and then I tossed it casually onto the table. It landed on the glass tabletop beneath the linen with a sharp, heavy clink that cut through the shouting. It slid across the damp tablecloth, coming to a dead stop right over the spilled mimosa directly in front of my father. "Jamal did not hack you, Trent," I said, my voice projecting with an absolute chilling authority that brought the entire table to a dead halt. "Jamal does not have the administrative clearance to lock down an international logistics network, and he certainly does not have the legal authority to shut off your operating systems." Trent stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, completely derailed by my total lack of panic. "Then who did it?" he demanded, his voice cracking. I gestured to the heavy metal card resting in front of my father. "Your enterprise software license was just revoked by the registered patent owner," I explained, enunciating every single syllable with crystal-clear precision. "Aegis Protocol initiated a full-scale, legally binding network blackout precisely 4 minutes ago. You breached the morality and criminal conduct clauses of your user agreement when you utilized that specific software to forge financial documents and extort a federal citizen. Your logistics company is currently operating on stolen, unlicensed software, which means your network will remain permanently dark." My father stared down at the black tungsten card. He read the embossed silver letters, Maya Williams, Aegis Protocol. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, closing the distance between me and the man who had called me a peasant. "I own Aegis Protocol." I stated the truth, finally stepping out of the shadows. "I hold the master patents for the proprietary routing algorithms, the encrypted payroll servers, and the global dispatch software that your entire family empire relies on to function. I built it from the ground up over the last 7 years." Chloe let out a high-pitched, breathless sound. It was a nervous, trembling laugh, the kind of sound someone makes when their reality fractures and their brain desperately tries to reject it. "Maya, stop." Chloe stammered, looking around at the staring crowd. "This is not a funny joke. You work at an IT help desk. Stop trying to embarrass Daddy and tell Jamal to turn the computers back on." But my father was not laughing. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at Trent or Vivian. Desmond Williams, the untouchable titan of Atlanta society, was staring down at the heavy metal business card with a look of pure, unadulterated devastation. The blood had completely abandoned his face, leaving his skin a terrifying shade of gray. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the raised silver lettering of my name. In that singular, beautiful moment, the absolute magnitude of his error crashed down upon him. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and I watched his entire worldview disintegrate. He realized that the quiet, disappointing daughter he had mocked, underestimated, and tried to frame held the absolute, indisputable keys to his entire empire. The shock on my father's face rapidly mutated into something far more dangerous. For 33 years, Desmond Williams had operated under a single, unshakable directive. He was the absolute authority, and I was the obedient, silent disappointment. The realization that I held the digital leash to his entire empire did not trigger surrender. It triggered a violent, desperate need to regain control. His massive hands slammed down onto the glass table, rattling the crystal glassware, and he lunged across the white linen. He reached for me, his fingers spread wide, fully intending to grab my arm and physically force my submission, just as he had done when I was a child. "Turn the servers back on, Maya," my father roared, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his pristine polo shirt. "Turn them back on right now, or I swear to God, I will ruin you. I will tie you and that holding company up in corporate litigation for the next 2 decades until you are completely bankrupt. I will destroy your life." His hand never reached me. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of my emerald blazer, a large, heavy hand clamped down on his wrist with the force of a steel vice. It was not Jamal who intercepted him. 2 men had materialized seemingly out of thin air, flanking our table, with a cold, imposing presence that instantly shattered the delicate, refined atmosphere of the Oak Creek Country Club. They were both tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing identical navy blue windbreakers. The stark yellow lettering printed across their backs read FBI. The entire dining terrace went completely dead. The polite murmur of high society gossip evaporated. The gentle clinking of silver forks against bone china ceased entirely. Waiters froze mid-step with trays of expensive champagne. Every single member of Atlanta's elite turned their heads, their eyes wide with shock, locking onto our table. The federal agents did not spare a single glance for my father. They simply shoved his arm back down toward the table with casual, dismissive force, rendering the mighty Desmond Williams completely powerless. They did not look at me, nor did they look at Jamal. Their sharp, calculating eyes were fixed, dead center, on Trent. Trent shrank back into his wrought iron chair, pressing himself against the cushions as if he were trying to merge with the metal. The last remaining drops of color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The smug, arrogant executive who had laughed at my IT career just minutes prior was now visibly shaking his breath, coming in short, panicked gasps. Trenton Davis, the lead agent, stated, his voice a deep, authoritative baritone that carried effortlessly across the silent, staring patio. "You are under arrest for corporate espionage, federal wire fraud, and extortion. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." The words hung in the crisp morning air like a judge's gavel. Trent did not stand. Instead, his survival instinct kicked in, and he instantly reverted to the cowardly, self-serving parasite he had always been. He raised his hands defensively, his eyes darting frantically toward my father. "No, wait, there is a massive mistake here," Trent stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "I did not act alone. I swear to you, I did not act alone. Desmond authorized the server access. He gave me the executive overrides. I only did what he told me to do." My father stared at the golden boy he had elevated above his own flesh and blood, watching the man he had protected instantly sell him out to the federal government to save his own skin. Desmond's jaw dropped, a profound, agonizing betrayal washing over his features. He had demanded I sacrifice my entire financial future to protect Trent, and Trent had handed him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. Vivian let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. The sound cut through the quiet terrace like shattered glass. She did not scream because her son-in-law was being arrested for federal crimes. She did not scream because he had just directly implicated her husband in a massive corporate fraud scheme. She screamed because she looked around the patio and made direct eye contact with the wives of the board of directors, the heads of the charity league, and the country club president. "You cannot do this here!" Vivian cried out, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the strand looked ready to snap. Her perfectly curated mask of aristocratic superiority completely dissolved into raw, humiliating panic. "Do you know who we are? We are founding members. You are ruining our reputation. If you must do this, take him out the back exit through the kitchens. Do not parade him through the dining room." The agents ignored her frantic pleas, stepping closer to Trent. Chloe, however, completely lost her grip on reality. The golden child who had never faced a single consequence in her entire pampered existence refused to accept that her pristine world was actively collapsing. She lunged forward, letting out a wild, primal scream. "Get your hands off my husband!" Chloe screeched, her manicured hands slapping frantically at the lead agent's arms as he reached for Trent. "You cannot arrest him. We have the best lawyers in the state. We will sue you. Let him go." The second agent stepped swiftly into Chloe's path. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute unyielding authority in his posture made her freeze in her tracks. "Ma'am," the agent said, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy warning. "Step back right now. If you interfere with a federal arrest, you will be placed in handcuffs and charged with obstruction of justice. Do you understand me?" Chloe gasped, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the table. She looked down at her hands, trembling violently, finally realizing that her tears, her wealth and her status meant absolutely nothing here. She was completely powerless. Trent was hauled up from his chair by the back of his tailored linen jacket. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly across the patio. He was whining, dragging his feet as the agents turned him around. "Please, Desmond, do something," Trent begged, tears streaming down his face as he looked back at my father. "Call the lawyers. Tell them it was your company. Tell them you gave me the access." My father did not answer. He sat completely paralyzed in his chair, staring blankly at the spilled mimosa soaking into the forged transfer deeds. The man who had ruled our family with an iron fist, who had called me a failure, who had demanded Jamal take the fall for a crime he never committed, was entirely broken. The agents marched Trent straight through the center of the country club terrace. They did not take the back exit. They paraded him directly past the tables of Atlanta's elite, his head bowed in absolute disgrace as the wealthy patrons stared in stunned, judgmental silence. Vivian buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her precious social standing evaporated into thin air. Jamal stood up slowly beside me, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. He looked down at my family not with anger, but with a quiet, profound pity. He reached out and gently rested his hand on the small of my back, a silent, steady anchor of support. I did not feel sorry for them. I felt a deep, purifying clarity. For 33 years I had shrunk myself down to make them comfortable. I had absorbed their insults, swallowed their cruelty, and accepted my role as the scapegoat just to keep the peace. But peace built on submission was never really peace at all. It was just a slow, quiet surrender. I stepped around the edge of the table until I was standing directly beside my father's chair. He did not look up at me. His broad shoulders were hunched forward, his powerful frame seeming to shrink under the crushing weight of his newly shattered reality. The illusion of his invincibility was gone. I leaned down slowly, placing both hands firmly on the edge of the table, bringing my face close to his ear. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp tang of his nervous sweat. "You told me failures do not belong in this family, Dad," I whispered, keeping my voice perfectly level and deadly calm. I pulled away, standing tall in the brilliant morning light. "Better call a lawyer. The audit starts at noon." 48 hours later, the shockwaves of Trent's arrest had completely decimated the carefully curated world of the Williams family. The financial fallout was absolute and merciless. Without the Aegis Protocol operating software, Desmond Logistics was functionally paralyzed. Hundreds of freight trucks sat idling at way stations across the country, unable to access their routing manifests or clear customs. Automated payroll distributions had bounced, sending the workforce into an immediate panic. The corporate bleeding was catastrophic, with industry analysts estimating my father's daily losses well into the seven figures. Meanwhile, Trent was sitting in a federal holding facility. The judge, citing Trent's extensive offshore financial connections and the overwhelming digital evidence we provided, had officially labeled him a severe flight risk and denied bail entirely. The golden son-in-law was trading his tailored linen suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Jamal and I were standing in the kitchen of our gentrifying neighborhood home, sipping black coffee and watching the morning news cycle cover the ongoing corporate scandal, when a violent, frantic pounding erupted at our front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, erratic hammering of someone completely unhinged. I set my mug down on the marble island, exchanging a glance with Jamal. He stepped forward, but I held up a hand, silently telling him I would handle this. I walked through the living room, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the heavy front door open. Chloe stood on my porch, and the sight of her was jarring. The flawless, pageant-winning golden child had completely evaporated. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled and haphazardly buttoned. Her normally pristine blowout was a tangled, chaotic mess, and dark streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, cutting through a thick layer of hastily applied foundation. She looked like a woman who had not slept, eaten, or stopped crying in 2 days. She looked exactly like a woman whose entire false reality had just been violently shattered. "You lied to us!" Chloe screamed the absolute second the door swung open. Her voice was shrill, echoing down the quiet, tree-lined street. She did not ask how I was. She did not apologize for her husband trying to frame mine. She instantly defaulted to the only defense mechanism she knew: aggressive, unadulterated entitlement. "You are a millionaire. You have been a millionaire for years. You sat there in your cheap clothes and your mediocre house and let us worry about you. You let us pity you. You owe this family an explanation, Maya." I crossed my arms over my chest, leaning casually against the doorframe. I watched her tremble with misplaced rage, utterly fascinated by her lack of self-awareness. "I did not let you pity me, Chloe," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I let you expose yourselves. There is a massive difference." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh, stepping closer to the threshold, though she made no move to cross it. Her hands were curled into tight fists at her sides. "Do not play semantics with me. You have millions of dollars sitting in corporate accounts, and my husband is rotting in a federal cell. Trent's assets have been completely frozen by the FBI. His accounts, our joint accounts, the investment portfolios, all of it. I cannot even buy groceries right now, Maya. The defense attorneys are demanding a $200,000 retainer just to look at his case file, and my father cannot liquidate anything because you locked down his entire company." She took a gasping, ragged breath, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are going to pay Trent's legal fees. You owe this family. You are going to wire the retainer to the defense firm today, and then you are going to turn Dad's servers back on. Family helps family, Maya. You have the money. You have to fix this." The sheer audacity of her demand hung in the cool morning air. She was standing on my porch, demanding I finance the criminal defense of a man who had actively tried to send my husband to prison just 48 hours prior. I looked at my older sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a hollow, clinical disgust. "Family helps family," I repeated softly, testing the words on my tongue. "That is a fascinating philosophy, Chloe. Tell me, did that philosophy apply during the spring of my sophomore year of college?" Chloe blinked, momentarily derailed by the sudden shift in conversation. "What are you talking about? My husband is in a federal holding facility, and you are bringing up ancient history." "I am bringing up the $75,000 that miraculously vanished from the family education trust right before my tuition was due," I said, taking a deliberate step forward. I remember sitting in the financial aid office, sobbing, terrified I was going to be kicked out of my degree program. I called Dad, begging for help. "Do you remember what he told me, Chloe?" "He told me the market had taken a bad turn. He told me the family had to tighten its belt." I watched the color begin to drain from her flushed face as she realized exactly where this was going. It was not until 3 years later that Aunt Jillian had one too many glasses of wine at Thanksgiving and let the truth slip. I continued, my voice sharp and precise. The market had not taken a bad turn at all. You had simply decided that an off-the-rack wedding gown was entirely beneath your dignity. You needed a custom hand-beaded Vera Wang dress imported from Europe. You needed a venue upgrade. You needed an ice sculpture imported from a glacial reserve. And Mom and Dad happily raided my college tuition fund to pay for your extravagant vanity project. They forced me to take out predatory high-interest student loans just to finish my education, all so you could play princess for a single afternoon. Chloe crossed her arms defensively, her jaw trembling. That was Dad's decision. I was the firstborn daughter. I had a reputation to uphold in our social circle. You did not even care about those things. You just wanted to sit in a library. It is not my fault they chose my wedding over your classes. Exactly, I agreed smoothly. Just like it is not my fault your husband is a federal criminal. I do not owe you a dime, Chloe. I do not owe you my wealth, my time, or my sympathy. Trent dug his own grave and you get to watch him lie in it. She let out a frustrated, guttural scream, stomping her foot against the wooden planks of the porch like a petulant toddler denied a toy. He is not a criminal. He just made a mistake. He made a bad call on some aggressive offshore trades. He was trying to build a legacy for us, Maya. He was trying to secure our future. He lost the money in the market and he panicked. He did not mean to hurt Jamal. He was just desperate. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the depth of the lies Trent had fed her and the absolute willingness with which she had swallowed them. He was her white knight, the handsome, privileged broker who elevated her status. She refused to see him as anything else. He did not lose the money in the market, Chloe, I said quietly. She stopped shouting. Her chest heaved as she stared at me, her brow furrowed in deep, panicked confusion. What do you mean? I turned my head slightly, looking back into the house. Jamal was already walking down the hallway, holding a thick manila folder. He stepped up beside me, his presence a solid, calming weight. He did not look angry. He looked at my sister with the exact same clinical pity a doctor reserves for a terminal patient. He handed the folder to me without a word. When you own the digital infrastructure of a company, I explained, tapping the manila folder against my palm, you see everything. My forensic accountants did not just lock down Desmond Logistics. They conducted a full retroactive audit of the system to trace exactly how Trent manipulated the session tokens. Trent is extremely arrogant, which means he was also extremely sloppy. We followed the digital footprints he left behind when he moved that $600,000. Chloe's eyes were locked onto the folder, her breathing growing shallow and rapid. What did he do with it? She whispered, her voice barely audible. He did not put it into aggressive offshore trades, I said, sliding the folder toward her. He routed it through 3 different shell companies and then wired it directly to a private real estate LLC based out of Florida. Chloe took the folder with shaking hands. She flipped it open. Inside was a stack of high-resolution photographs and property deed records my investigators had pulled late last night. The first photograph showed a stunning multi-million-dollar beachfront townhouse in Miami. The second photograph, captured from a private investigator's surveillance camera, showed Trent walking out of that exact townhouse. He was not alone. He had his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of a beautiful, much younger blonde woman. They were laughing, leaning in to kiss each other in the bright Florida sunlight. The timestamp in the corner of the photograph was dated precisely 3 weeks ago. That was the weekend Trent told you he was attending an intensive logistics and supply chain conference in Dallas, Jamal stated quietly, delivering the final crushing blow. He did not embezzle your father's money to secure your future, Chloe. He stole $500,000 to buy a luxury love nest for his mistress. Chloe stared at the photograph. The silence on the porch was absolute, broken only by the sound of a distant lawnmower. I watched her perfectly constructed high society illusion completely shatter. Her eyes darted rapidly across the images, searching for any detail she could use to deny the truth. But there was none. The man she had paraded around the country club, the man she had allowed to demean me, the man she had defended just seconds ago, had been using her family's wealth to fund a secret life. The manila folder slipped from her hands. The photographs scattered across the wooden planks of my porch, the glossy images of Trent and his mistress catching the morning sun. Chloe's knees buckled. She stumbled forward, catching herself against one of the porch pillars. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, sharp gasps of air, her hands clutching at her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Maya, she choked out her voice, a devastated, broken sob. Maya, please, I have nothing. The accounts are frozen. The house is in his name. I cannot go back to Mom and Dad. Dad is screaming at the lawyers. He is facing his own indictment. Please, Maya, I do not know what to do. Let me come inside. Just let me come inside and sit down, please. She reached a trembling hand toward the doorframe, begging for sanctuary from the very sister she had spent a lifetime tormenting. She wanted me to comfort her. She wanted me to absorb her pain just as I had always absorbed her cruelty. I looked down at her, feeling no triumph, no joy, just the quiet, heavy finality of a closed chapter. You can start by calling an Uber, Chloe. I said, my voice perfectly calm. My husband and I are very busy. I stepped back inside the house, bringing Jamal with me, and closed the heavy mahogany door securely in her face, the lock sliding into place with a sharp, definitive click. 72 hours after my mother fled my office in absolute disgrace, the phone call came. It was not from a family member begging for another handout or demanding my submission. It was a direct call from the United States Attorney's Office. Trent's defense lawyer, a high-priced corporate shark who had somehow been convinced to take the case on a promise of future payment, had reached out to the federal prosecutor. Trent wanted to broker a plea deal. He was terrified out of options and desperately wanted to turn state's evidence. The prosecutor requested that Jamal and I be present for the proffer session, given our status as the primary victims of his attempted corporate framing. Walking into the federal building downtown was a stark, sobering contrast to the plush carpets and crystal chandeliers of the Oak Creek Country Club. The air inside the interrogation room was sterile and recycled, smelling faintly of harsh floor wax and institutional coffee. The walls were cinderblock, painted a dull, lifeless gray that seemed to absorb the fluorescent lighting. A heavy metal table bolted to the floor occupied the center of the room. Jamal and I sat on one side, flanked by the lead federal prosecutor and the 2 FBI agents who had executed the arrest on the dining terrace. The heavy steel door swung open and 2 armed guards escorted Trent inside. The physical transformation was striking. The custom-tailored linen suits, the expensive Italian loafers, and the perfectly manicured appearance were entirely gone. Trent wore a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow his frame. His normally pristine blonde hair was greasy and unkempt, and the arrogant, entitled sneer that usually dominated his face had been replaced by a look of sheer, trembling panic. His lawyer, a man named Sterling, wearing a sharp charcoal suit, sat down next to him and immediately opened a thick leather briefcase. The federal prosecutor started the recording device, stating the date, time, and the names of everyone present for the official record. He then looked directly at Trent, sternly warning him that a proffer session required absolute, unvarnished honesty. Any lie told during this meeting would immediately void any potential immunity agreement and result in additional federal charges. Trent nodded enthusiastically, his hands clasped so tightly together on the metal table that his knuckles were stark white. Then Trent turned on the waterworks. It was a masterful, sickening performance. Real tears welled up in his eyes and spilled rapidly down his pale cheeks. His voice shook with manufactured trauma and rehearsed vulnerability. He looked at the federal prosecutor, then at the FBI agents, and began to paint a vivid picture of himself as a helpless victim trapped in a terrifying, inescapable situation. He claimed he was completely innocent of the initial embezzlement. He spun a wild narrative where Desmond Williams was not just a demanding boss, but a tyrannical, aggressive warlord who ran his logistics empire through fear and physical intimidation. Trent leaned heavily into coded language, weaponizing his own clean-cut white executive persona against the image of my father. He used words like hostile, threatening, and physically imposing to describe Desmond. He was deliberately attempting to trigger the implicit systemic biases of the federal authorities in the room. He wanted them to look at the wealthy, powerful black patriarch and automatically assume criminality. He wanted them to view the crying white man sitting in front of them as a naive hostage who had been forced to cook the books under the direct threat of violence. "I was absolutely terrified of him," Trent stammered, wiping his eyes with the back of his trembling hand. "You do not understand how Desmond operates behind closed doors. He demanded absolute loyalty. He told me the company was facing liquidity issues and ordered me to move those funds offshore to protect his assets from the IRS. I told him it was illegal. I begged him not to make me do it, but he cornered me in his office. He is a massive guy. He stood over me and told me that if I did not route the money exactly how he instructed, he would destroy my career and ruin my marriage to his daughter. I only moved the money because I genuinely feared for my physical safety." Trent paused, letting out a ragged, pathetic sob, and then he made his fatal error. He turned his tear-filled eyes toward me, attempting to pull me into his web of deceit. He thought my hatred for my family would make me a willing accomplice to his perjury. "Maya, you know how your dad is," Trent pleaded, his voice cracking with artificial desperation. "You grew up with him. You know he is aggressive. You know he controls everyone through fear. Tell them. Tell them he made me do it. I was just trying to keep the company afloat to protect Chloe." The silence in the small interrogation room was heavy and suffocating. The prosecutor looked between Trent and me, his pen hovering over his yellow legal pad, waiting to see if I would corroborate the story and hand them Desmond Williams on a silver platter. Jamal broke the silence. A deep, booming laugh erupted from my husband's chest. It was a rich, genuine sound of pure, unadulterated amusement that bounced loudly off the cinder-block walls. The sound completely shattered the fragile, dramatic atmosphere Trent had tried so hard to build. Trent flinched, his fake tears instantly drying up as a flash of genuine anger crossed his face. The defense attorney looked at Jamal with sharp professional annoyance. "I am failing to see the humor here," Mr. Williams Sterling snapped, closing his notepad. "My client is providing vital federal testimony regarding a major corporate crime syndicate. Your client is currently committing a federal crime right in front of you," Jamal replied, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms, looking entirely relaxed. "And it is actually hilarious to watch." Hilarious, too. I did not laugh. I kept my eyes locked onto Trent, watching his throat swallow nervously. My father was an arrogant, deeply flawed man. He was emotionally abusive, demanding, and fiercely elitist. He had treated me like a peasant for 3 decades, but he was not a criminal. He had built his company from the ground up through ruthless business tactics, not fraud. I despise Desmond Williams, but I absolutely refuse to sit in a federal building and watch a mediocre white man weaponize systemic racism to send a black man to prison for his own crimes. Trent had tried to use Jamal as a scapegoat, and now he was trying to use Desmond. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small encrypted black flash drive. I placed it onto the center of the metal table with a heavy metallic thud. Every eye in the room dropped to the device. "My father is a terrible parent, Trent," I said, my voice slicing through the stale air with absolute unyielding precision. "He is a narcissist and a bully, but he is not the architect of this fraud. You are. And you are also a terrible liar." Trent's face went completely rigid. "What is that?" he asked, his voice losing all of its theatrical tremor. "When you tried to frame my husband for your embezzlement, you fundamentally underestimated who you were dealing with," I explained, looking directly at the federal prosecutor. "Before I initiated the Aegis Protocol blackout and revoked the operating software for Desmond Logistics, I ran a comprehensive backdoor audit on every single device connected to the corporate network. That included Trent's personal cell phone, his encrypted home laptop, and his private cloud storage." Sterling, the defense attorney, sat up incredibly straight, his posture instantly transforming from relaxed confidence to rigid professional panic. He looked at Trent, his eyes narrowing. On this drive, I continued tapping the black metal casing with my index finger. are hundreds of heavily encrypted emails between Trent and his offshore banking contacts in the Cayman Islands. These communications date back to over a year ago, proving this embezzlement was planned meticulously and completely independent of my father. You will also find the direct wire transfer receipts showing Trent moving the stolen corporate funds into a dummy LLC to purchase a multi-million-dollar property in Miami. Trent was gripping the edge of the metal table so hard his fingers were turning purple. He was staring at the flash drive as if it were a live grenade about to detonate. But the most interesting part of the audit, I said, leaning forward and looking dead into Trent's terrified eyes, are the private messages between Trent and his mistress. He outlines his entire plan to frame Jamal. He explicitly details how he was going to manipulate the server logs to make it look like the newly hired black son-in-law was stealing the money because Jamal would be the easiest target for the authorities to believe. Trent planned the theft, executed the theft, bought the real estate, and orchestrated the frame job entirely on his own. Desmond Williams knew absolutely nothing about it until the servers shut down. The federal prosecutor picked up the flash drive, his expression turning to stone as he looked at Trent. You understand that lying during a proffer session instantly revokes any possibility of a plea agreement, Mr. Davis. We will be adding obstruction of justice and perjury to your indictment this afternoon. Trent turned to his lawyer, his eyes wide and frantic. "Sterling, do something!" he hissed, his voice rising in high-pitched panic. "Object to that. That is an illegal search. She hacked my personal devices. You have to throw that out." Sterling did not object. He did not say a single word in defense of his client. Instead, the seasoned attorney slowly and deliberately reached out and closed his thick leather notepad. He gathered his expensive fountain pen, placed it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and reached for his briefcase. The sharp metallic snap of the briefcase latches closing echoed loudly in the small room. It sounded exactly like the closing of a coffin lid. "What are you doing?" Trent demanded, his voice cracking as he watched his only lifeline prepare to leave. "You explicitly assured me in writing that you were completely truthful regarding your level of involvement and your claims of coercion," Sterling said, his voice dripping with professional disgust. "You lied to me, and you just lied to a federal prosecutor in my presence. I cannot and will not represent a client who commits perjury during a proffer session. Our professional relationship is terminated effective immediately." Sterling stood up, gave a brief, respectful nod to the prosecutor, and walked straight out of the interrogation room, the heavy steel door shutting firmly behind him. Trent was left sitting alone at the metal table, completely abandoned. The realization of his total, inescapable ruin finally crashed down upon him. He had no money, no wife, no lawyer, and now no possibility of a plea deal. He was going to spend decades in a federal prison. He snapped. Trent lunged across the table toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You ruined my life!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he thrashed against the heavy chains linking his handcuffs to his waist. "You worthless IT trash! I will destroy you!" The two FBI agents were on him in a fraction of a second. They grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling him violently backward away from the table. Trent kicked and thrashed, his orange jumpsuit twisting around his body as he fought against the agents with the desperate, wild strength of a cornered animal. Jamal did not even flinch. He simply reached over, picked up my hand from the table, and gently kissed my knuckles completely, ignoring the screaming man being subdued. Trent continued to hurl vile, hateful obscenities at me, his voice echoing down the cinderblock hallway as the guards physically dragged him out of the room. I sat perfectly still, listening to his screams fade into the distance, until the heavy steel door slammed shut one final time, leaving the interrogation room in absolute perfect silence. The click of my heels against the polished marble stairs sounded like the steady, rhythmic ticking of a metronome counting down to a catastrophic detonation. The blinding glare of the spotlight followed my every move, tracking my ascent, until I stood directly behind the grand, transparent acrylic podium. I rested my hands on the cool, smooth edges of the lectern and looked out over the sprawling, cavernous ballroom. 500 of Atlanta's most elite citizens stared back at me in absolute silence. These were the titans of industry, the political kingmakers, the generational wealth hoarders, and the charity board directors. These were the exact people my parents had spent over 3 decades desperately trying to impress, by tearing me down and hiding my very existence in the shadows of my older sister. I adjusted the microphone. The sharp, piercing squeal of audio feedback echoed off the high, frescoed ceilings, forcing a heavy, breathless anticipation to fall over the room. In the second row, perfectly illuminated by the ambient chandelier lighting, I saw my mother. Vivian was gripping the edge of her platinum-tier table so hard her knuckles were bone-white. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths, her silver-beaded gown sparkling violently with every frantic movement. 2 tables over my father sat completely paralyzed. Desmond Williams stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The undisputed titan of logistics finally realized he was entirely at the mercy of the daughter he had treated like a disposable peasant. "Good evening," I began, my voice ringing clear, steady, and unapologetically dominant through the massive sound system. "We are gathered here tonight under the banner of the Heritage Charity Gala. We are here to celebrate legacy community and the pristine image of high society excellence. My parents, Desmond and Vivian Williams, have spent their entire lives building an image of absolute perfection. They have cultivated a flawless, impenetrable facade designed to project wealth, stability, and unshakable moral authority to everyone in this room." I paused, letting the heavy words hang in the cool, air-conditioned air. The crowd was completely captivated, shifting comfortably in their tailored tuxedos and silk gowns, expecting a traditional heartwarming tale of philanthropic dedication. They had absolutely no idea what was coming, but true excellence requires integrity. I continued, my tone dropping slightly, losing the polite warmth of a gala sponsor and taking on the sharp clinical precision of a federal prosecutor. And integrity is the one currency the Williams family entirely lacks. I did not come here tonight to talk about charity. I came here to talk about the staggering, destructive cost of keeping up appearances. I came here to talk about the truth. A low, confused murmur rippled through the back of the ballroom. I saw several board members exchange nervous, questioning glances. Vivian desperately signaled a passing waiter, frantically waving her hands to get the attention of the event coordinator. She wanted them to cut my microphone. I smiled, looking directly up at the glass-enclosed audio-visual booth suspended high above the balcony. The technicians up there were not moving a single muscle. Aegis Protocol had signed their premium overtime checks this morning. My microphone was not going anywhere. For the past several months, Desmond Logistics has been quietly hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate. I stated, projecting my voice to reach the furthest velvet-draped walls of the hall. The company you all believe to be an untouchable, debt-free empire was being bled dry from the inside out. The architect of that destruction was not market volatility or a bad economic turn. The architect was my brother-in-law, Trent Davis, the golden boy executive who stood right here on this exact stage last year accepting your accolades. Trent embezzled millions of dollars from corporate accounts to fund a secret life-buying luxury beachfront real estate for his mistress, while leaving my father's company teetering on the absolute edge of bankruptcy. The gasps were loud and entirely audible now. 500 socialites shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging horrified looks. The perfectly manicured illusion of the Williams family was violently cracking in real time. When my father discovered the missing millions, he did not call the authorities. I said, gripping the edges of the podium tighter. He did not file an insurance claim or have Trent arrested. Doing that would have caused a massive public scandal. It would have humiliated him in front of all of you. It would have jeopardized his standing at this exact charity gala. So Desmond and Trent devised a different plan. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to take the fall so the company could survive, and their social standing could remain utterly spotless. I looked down at Jamal. My husband was sitting at our table in the front row, looking up at me with unwavering pride and quiet, brilliant strength. He nodded once, a silent anchor in a room full of shifting loyalties. They chose my husband Jamal. I continued, my voice thick with absolute disgust. A brilliant, innocent black man who had just been hired to update their obsolete cybersecurity framework. My father and Trent colluded to plant fabricated digital evidence on Jamal's private servers. They intended to frame him for federal wire fraud. They relied heavily and deliberately on systemic bias to execute their plan. They banked on the insidious racist assumption that the authorities, the media, and polite society would instantly believe the worst about a black man from outside their privileged circle, rather than suspecting the clean-cut, tailored white executive who was actually draining them dry. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers and frantic conversation. The sheer weight of the accusation was staggering. I was accusing a prominent business leader of a malicious, racially motivated corporate frame job in front of his entire social network and the city's political elite. From her seat in the second row, Vivian practically leaped out of her chair. "Maya, stop this right now," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unrestrained hysteria. She turned to the crowd, waving her hands desperately, her silver armor-like dress catching the light. "Do not listen to her. She is unwell. She is lying. She is trying to destroy us out of petty childhood jealousy." I stared down at my mother, feeling absolutely no pity, no regret, and no hesitation. "I know a claim like this sounds entirely outrageous in polite society," I said, projecting my voice effortlessly over Vivian's panicked screaming. "It sounds like bitter dramatic fiction. But I did not come here tonight to just tell you a story. I am the chief executive officer of a corporate cybersecurity firm. I do not deal in rumors, and I do not deal in family gossip. I deal in hard, verifiable data. I brought the receipts." I looked up at the glass window of the audio-visual booth and gave a sharp, definitive nod. The lead technician hit the main playback switch. The string quartet had completely stopped playing minutes ago. The room was deathly quiet, except for the rustling of expensive fabric and the frantic, heavy breathing of my parents. Then the sharp crackle of an uncompressed audio file engaged over the massive state-of-the-art ballroom speakers. The acoustic echo of the Oak Creek Country Club men's lounge filled the room. The audio quality was pristine, crystal clear, and undeniably authentic. The faint clinking of whiskey glasses and the distant hum of golf carts could be heard perfectly in the background, anchoring the recording in brutal reality. My father's deep, booming voice echoed from every speaker in the grand hall. "He is the perfect fall guy," Desmond's recorded voice stated, callous and dripping with arrogant, monstrous certainty. "No one is going to question a black kid with access to the servers. The optics work entirely in our favor, Trent. The feds will take one look at him and close the book. We bury Jamal, we protect you, and the company stays intact. No one in our circle ever has to know. We handle this in-house." The recording clicked off, plunging the ballroom back into a suffocating, devastating silence. The fallout was instantaneous and explosive. The collective gasp from the elite crowd sounded like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room at once. Someone dropped a crystal champagne flute, and the sharp sound of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot. Wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites physically recoiled, pulling their chairs away from the tables where my family was seated, as if the Williams name had suddenly become a highly contagious disease. The undeniable clarity of the recording left absolutely no room for interpretation, denial, or defense. They had all just heard Desmond Williams plotting to destroy an innocent man's life, simply to protect his own fragile ego and his country club status. The paralysis that had been gripping my father finally broke. The shock evaporated, instantly replaced by a violent, consuming, adrenaline-fueled rage. The mask of the refined, philanthropic patriarch completely shattered, leaving behind only the aggressive tyrant I had always known behind closed doors. Desmond kicked his chair back so violently it crashed to the polished marble floor. He lunged forward, shoving past horrified waiters and stumbling socialites who scrambled to get out of his way. His face was a dark mottled purple, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his tuxedo collar as he charged the stage with terrifying, unhinged speed. "You ungrateful wretch!" Desmond roared, his voice raw and thunderous, echoing through the chaotic, screaming ballroom as he vaulted up the side stairs of the stage. "Turn that off. Turn it off right now." Desmond lunged up the velvet-carpeted stairs of the stage, his heavy footfalls thudding against the hollow wood. His fists were balled so tightly, his knuckles shone stark white against his flushed, furious skin. He looked like a cornered beast, a man whose entire kingdom had just evaporated into dust, acting purely on violent instinct. He aimed straight for me, his massive frame carrying decades of unchecked aggressive entitlement. Jamal moved with the smooth, lethal speed of a man who had spent his life protecting what was his. He stepped seamlessly between me and my father, his broad shoulders squaring off, creating an impenetrable physical barrier. Jamal did not raise his hands. He did not need to. His mere presence, tall and unyielding in his midnight blue tuxedo, forced Desmond to halt mid-stride. My father crashed against the invisible wall of Jamal's quiet, commanding authority, his chest heaving as he stared up at the black man he had actively tried to destroy to save his own skin. The juxtaposition was striking. Desmond, the crumbling, frantic fraud, and Jamal, the absolute embodiment of poised, undeniable excellence. I placed a gentle hand on Jamal's forearm. He glanced back at me, reading the absolute resolve in my eyes, and slowly stepped aside. He remained close enough to intercept any sudden movements, but he gave me the floor. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground behind the clear acrylic podium and looked down at the man who had spent 3 decades making me feel incredibly small. "You ungrateful wretch!" Desmond spat, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and sheer panic. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, ignoring the hundreds of eyes boring into his back. "I gave you everything. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your life. I built the name you carry, and this is how you repay me. You hack my company and drag private family business into the street. You are ruining us over a misunderstanding." I leaned directly into the microphone. My voice echoed across the breathless, silent ballroom, reaching every wealthy investor, every society reporter, and every board member who had just witnessed his spectacular unraveling. "You gave me nothing but conditional love and disrespect," I said, the words ringing out with crystal clear precision. "You gave me a lifetime of being treated as a secondary citizen in my own home. You raided my college funds to pay for Chloe's vanity. You mocked my career choices. And when your golden, clean-cut white son-in-law stole millions of dollars to fund his infidelity, you actively conspired to frame my innocent husband. You tried to send a good man to a federal penitentiary purely to protect a thief and save your precious country club reputation. You did not build a legacy, Desmond. You built a house of cards on the backs of people you thought were beneath you." Desmond opened his mouth, but no words came out. The absolute truth of my statement, backed by the undeniable audio recording still hanging in the heavy air, stripped him of any possible defense. He looked out at the sea of faces in the grand ballroom. The people who had worshipped him an hour ago, who had eagerly sought his business advice and drank his expensive scotch, were now looking at him with naked, unfiltered disgust. "You thought I was weak?" I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, icy calm that commanded absolute attention. "You thought I was the obedient, invisible daughter who would just swallow the abuse and keep the family secrets buried for the sake of appearances. But independence is the ultimate leverage. You built your empire on intimidation and fraud. I built mine on pure, verifiable data. You gave me 30 years of contempt, and in return I just gave you an eviction notice." Vivian let out a strangled, horrifying gasp from the floor below. She pressed both hands against her mouth, her silver-beaded gown catching the light as she swayed on her feet. Desmond blinked rapidly, the blind rage in his eyes momentarily replaced by profound, staggering confusion. "An eviction notice?" Desmond repeated, his voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper that was picked up by the highly sensitive microphone. "What are you talking about? You cannot evict me from my own estate. I own that property outright. It has been in my name for 20 years. "You used to own it outright," I corrected him smoothly, enjoying the meticulous destruction of his reality. "But then Trent started bleeding your corporate accounts dry. You panicked. You needed liquid capital to cover the massive logistical shortfalls Trent created to keep the shipping lanes moving. So you secretly took out a massive secondary mortgage on the family estate. A predatory high-interest loan you could barely afford to service, hidden beneath 3 layers of corporate shell companies." I watched the realization strike him like a physical blow. His jaw went completely slack. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving a sickly ashen gray behind. When Trent lost the last of the embezzled funds buying real estate for his mistress, "You defaulted on that mortgage," I explained, laying out the financial execution for the entire room to hear. "You missed 3 consecutive payments. The holding company was preparing to foreclose. But they never got the chance. Aegis Protocol swooped in and bought your distressed debt for pennies on the dollar. I own the paper on your mansion, Desmond. I am your landlord." I raised my right hand and gestured toward the main entrance of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. 3 men in sharp-tailored suits strode purposefully down the center aisle. This was my elite corporate legal team. They moved with absolute efficiency, ignoring the flashing cameras and the frantic murmurs of the stunned crowd. The lead attorney, a razor-sharp litigator named Marcus, walked directly up to the stage. He did not look at Vivian as he passed her. He did not flinch as Desmond glared down at him. Marcus simply reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, legally binding document sealed in a transparent folder, and handed it directly to my father. Desmond took the folder with trembling hands. He stared at the bold, capitalized letters printed across the front page. "Notice of immediate foreclosure and order to vacate." "The paperwork is completely ironclad," I announced into the microphone, ensuring the local press corps situated near the back of the room captured every single syllable. "The grace period expired yesterday. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property. If you leave so much as a single piece of trash on the driveway, I will have my attorneys bill you for the removal fees. You are officially bankrupt and you are officially homeless." Vivian finally snapped. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her total social and financial destruction broke through her carefully constructed facade. She scrambled up the stairs of the stage, her expensive heels slipping on the velvet carpet. She threw herself at Desmond, grabbing his arm and shaking him frantically. "Tell them it is a lie!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, unrecognizable pitch. "Desmond, do something. She cannot take the house. Where will we go? The club will cancel our memberships. The board will remove me. Tell her she cannot do this. We are the Williams family. We do not get evicted." Desmond looked down at the foreclosure papers, his eyes wide and vacant. He had nothing left to say. His empire was dead. His freedom was currently pending a federal fraud investigation. His entire legacy was reduced to the heavy legal document trembling in his hands. He was a broken man, entirely hollowed out by his own arrogance. I stepped back from the podium, signaling the end of the presentation. I looked to the perimeter of the ballroom, where a dozen highly trained private security contractors stood at absolute attention. I had not used the venue's standard security detail for this event. I had brought in my own team from Aegis Protocol. They answered exclusively to me. "Escort Mr. and Mrs. Williams off the premises," I commanded clearly, my voice resonating one final time over the speakers. "They are no longer welcome at this gala, and they are officially trespassing on a privately sponsored event." The security team moved in perfect unison. 4 large, imposing guards ascended the stage. They did not use excessive force, but their intent was absolute and unyielding. They flanked my parents, placing firm hands on Desmond's broad shoulders and guiding a hysterical Vivian away from the podium. "You cannot do this to me!" Vivian wailed, thrashing wildly against the guard's grip as they began to march her down the stairs. "I am Vivian Williams. I founded this charity. I am the chairwoman. You are a monster, Maya. You are a vindictive, ungrateful monster." I watched them being paraded down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The silence of the elite crowd was completely gone now, replaced by the frantic, rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters. The local society photographers originally invited by Vivian to document her triumph were now capturing the absolute, undisputed climax of her ruin. Flashes of blinding white light illuminated the dark room in a strobe effect of pure devastation. They captured Desmond, the fallen titan, staring blankly at the floor with his foreclosure papers clutched to his chest. They captured Vivian, her face contorted in a sobbing, mascara-streaked mask of pure hysteria, being physically manhandled out of her own event. Every desperate tear, every humiliating scream, every single second of their staggering downfall was immortalized by the flashbulbs. Tomorrow morning, those images would be splashed across the front page of every digital news outlet and society blog in the state. The Williams name would be entirely synonymous with fraud, racism, and catastrophic failure. They would never show their faces in polite society again. Jamal stepped up beside me, wrapping his arms securely around my waist. We stood on the stage together, bathed in the warm spotlight, watching the heavy mahogany doors slam shut behind my parents. The toxic, suffocating weight of my childhood was finally gone, dragged out of the building by my own security detail. I turned to the audio-visual booth and gave one final nod. The string quartet, taking their cue, immediately resumed playing a lively, uplifting symphony. The music swelled, filling the cavernous ballroom and washing away the last lingering echoes of Vivian's screaming. I looked out at the 500 guests. They had witnessed the violent death of one dynasty and the undeniable rise of another. I took my husband's hand, raised my chin, and prepared to enjoy the rest of my evening. The morning air was sharp and indifferent, offering a crisp breeze that did absolutely nothing to soften the brutal reality unfolding on the sprawling grounds of my parents' estate. 2 days had passed since the gala, and the absolute destruction of the Williams family legacy was now a physical, undeniable spectacle. I stood at the end of the long circular driveway, a steaming cup of coffee in my hand, watching an army of professional liquidators dismantle 30 years of carefully curated arrogance. 4 massive, unmarked moving trucks idled on the pristine cobblestones. Dozens of men in gray uniforms marched in and out of the grand double doors, carrying away the heavily financed artifacts of Vivian and Desmond's fraudulent empire. I watched without a single ounce of sentimentality as my mother's imported Italian chandeliers were carefully crated and wheeled down the front steps. Next came the antique Persian rugs, followed tightly by the custom leather sofas from my father's mahogany-lined study. Every single item being loaded into those trucks represented a debt they could not pay, a promise they had broken, or a lie they had told to maintain their precarious grip on high society. My property manager, a highly efficient woman named Sarah, stood beside me with a digital tablet, quietly checking off the inventory of assets being reclaimed by the creditors. Aegis Protocol now owned the deed to the property, but the crushing mountain of secondary liens Desmond had taken out against his own furniture was a separate matter. The bank was taking everything inside the walls to satisfy the outstanding balances. By noon, the mansion would be a hollow, echoing shell, entirely stripped of its false grandeur. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute silence from my parents. Desmond and Vivian had vacated the premises late last night, fleeing to a discounted extended-stay motel on the outskirts of the city. They had no friends left to house them. Their country club peers had immediately severed all ties, terrified that the federal fraud investigation would somehow splatter onto their own pristine reputations. The low hum of the idling trucks was suddenly interrupted by the loud metallic screech of failing brakes. A battered, faded yellow city taxi violently lurched to a halt at the bottom of the private driveway. The passenger door swung open, and Chloe stumbled out onto the pavement. The sight of my older sister was genuinely jarring. The flawless, pageant-winning golden child who had spent her entire existence looking down on the rest of the world from her luxury pedestal had completely evaporated. Her signature blonde blowout was flattened and stringy, pulled back into a hasty, uneven knot at the nape of her neck. She was wearing a beige designer trench coat, but it was deeply wrinkled as if she had slept in it for 2 consecutive nights. Dark, bruised circles shadowed her eyes, completely devoid of her usual expensive cosmetics. She turned back to the taxi driver, engaging in a frantic, hostile exchange of words through the open window. She gestured wildly, her face flushed with indignation, before finally digging into a scuffed leather handbag and shoving a handful of crumpled bills at the driver. The taxi sped away immediately, leaving her standing alone at the foot of the driveway, staring up at the moving trucks. Chloe began the long walk up the incline. Her shoulders were hunched and her gait lacked any of its usual arrogant bounce. She looked entirely broken, A woman who had woken up from a lifelong dream to find herself standing in a nightmare. She spotted me standing near the grand entrance and immediately quickened her pace, her heels dragging heavily against the stone pavers. She did not look angry. She looked like a drowning victim, desperately reaching for a life raft. "Maya," she gasped, stopping a few feet away from me. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her eyes darting frantically toward the men carrying a massive antique mirror out the front doors. "They are actually taking it. They are taking everything. They are reclaiming assets to satisfy delinquent accounts." "Chloe," I replied, my voice cool and thoroughly clinical. "That is what happens when you buy a lifestyle on stolen credit." She did not fire back with her usual venom. She simply wrapped her arms tightly around her own waist, shivering in the brisk morning air, despite her heavy coat. "Trent was denied bail yesterday afternoon." She whispered, the reality of the words choking her. "The federal magistrate said he was an extreme flight risk. They seized the townhouse in Miami. They seized our primary residence. They froze my personal checking accounts, Maya. The government took everything with a dollar sign attached to it." I handed my empty coffee cup to Sarah, signaling her to give us a moment of privacy. I turned my full attention to my sister, waiting for the inevitable demand disguised as a request. I spent the last 2 nights sleeping on an air mattress in Jenna's basement. Chloe continued, tears welling in her eyes and spilling over her pale cheeks. "But her husband told me I have to leave today. He works in finance, and he said having the wife of a high-profile federal fraud suspect in his house is a massive liability. I have absolutely nowhere to go. Mom and Dad are in a single room near the interstate, and they will not even answer my calls. Desmond blames Trent for everything." "That is entirely accurate," I stated blankly. "Trent is the reason Desmond Logistics failed." Chloe stepped closer, abandoning all pretense of pride. She reached out, her trembling fingers hovering just inches from my sleeve, desperately seeking any shred of the familial submissiveness she had always demanded from me. "Please, Maya," she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic sob. "You have that massive property out in the suburbs. I know you have a guest house. It sits empty all year. I just need a place to sleep, just until the lawyers sort out this mess and unlock my personal funds. I will stay completely out of your way. You will not even know I am there. We're sisters, Maya. We're blood." The absolute audacity of her plea hung heavily in the space between us. She had spent 3 decades treating me like an embarrassing inconvenience. She had actively participated in my financial and emotional starvation, cheering from the sidelines, while Vivian and Desmond sacrificed my future to fund her vanity. And now, stripped of her stolen wealth, she dared to invoke the sacred bond of sisterhood. I looked at her, my expression remaining completely flat, devoid of a single ounce of pity. "Blood doesn't mean loyalty," I said, my words dropping like heavy stones onto the pavement. "Blood is a biological coincidence, Chloe. Loyalty is a deliberate choice, a choice you never made." She flinched, pulling her hands back to her chest as if I had physically struck her. "I did not know what Trent was doing," she stammered, fresh tears tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. "You cannot punish me for his crimes. I did not know about the embezzlement or the mistress." "But you knew about the frame job," I countered, my voice hardening into sharp, undeniable steel. I stepped forward, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "Do not stand on my driveway and play the innocent betrayed wife. You knew exactly what Trent and Desmond were planning to do to Jamal. You knew they were actively conspiring to send an innocent black man to a federal penitentiary to take the fall for Trent's greed. And you said absolutely nothing." Chloe opened her mouth to deny it, but the words died in her throat. She looked down at the cobblestones, unable to hold my gaze. "You stood by and laughed while they orchestrated the destruction of my husband." I continued, mercilessly dissecting her hypocrisy. "You smiled at me at country club dinners, mocking my clothes and my career, acting like you were the pinnacle of society. You thought you were so much better than me, but your entire existence was a fraud. You mocked my career while secretly relying on the wealth I was building. Aegis Protocol has been quietly subsidizing the failing infrastructure of Desmond Logistics for over a year. I was funding your designer wardrobe, and your lavish vacations while you were busy trying to destroy my family. I am sorry, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently as the full weight of her moral bankruptcy crashed down upon her. I was scared, Maya. I was terrified of losing everything. I did not want to go back to being a nobody. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored emerald blazer. I had anticipated this exact scenario the moment I finalized the eviction paperwork for my parents. I knew Chloe would eventually run out of friends and turn to the only person in the family with actual liquid capital. I pulled out a single sheet of neatly folded white paper and a crisp $20 bill. I held them out between us, waiting for her to lower her hands. Chloe wiped her eyes, looking at the items with deep, desperate confusion. She slowly reached out and took the paper, unfolding it with trembling fingers. It is a printed job application. I explained, my tone entirely devoid of emotion. It is for an entry-level data entry position at one of the subsidiary branches of Aegis Protocol. The starting pay is $18 an hour. It includes basic medical benefits and a commuter pass for the city bus line. Chloe stared at the standard corporate application form as if it were written in an alien language. She had never held a real job in her life. She had transitioned seamlessly from Desmond's bank account to Trent's stolen fortune. I do not understand, she whispered, looking up at me. Where am I supposed to live? There is a list of affordable extended stay boarding houses printed on the back of that application, I replied. The $20 will cover your bus fare back to the city center and a cheap lunch. Maya, you cannot be serious. She gasped, a fresh wave of panic gripping her features as she stared at the $20 bill. I cannot work data entry. I do not know how to ride a public bus. I am your sister. You have millions. You cannot just leave me on the street. I looked at the moving trucks hauling away the last remnants of the life she used to worship. The illusion was dead, and I had absolutely no interest in funding its resurrection. Welcome to the real world, Chloe, I said, delivering the final definitive blow. Start climbing. I did not wait for her to respond. I did not stay to watch her cry over a $20 bill. I simply turned my back on the golden child of the Williams family and walked calmly down the driveway toward my car, leaving her standing alone in the ruins of her own entitlement. 4 months is a brief fraction of a human lifetime. Yet it is an absolute eternity when you are watching a generational legacy decompose in real time. The transition from the extravagant velvet-draped ballrooms of Atlanta's high society to the sterile, unyielding concrete of the federal courthouse was a stark, poetic reality. The building was a monolithic structure of gray stone and reinforced glass, specifically designed by the government to make anyone who entered its walls feel incredibly small and entirely powerless. Today, however, I did not feel small. I walked through the heavy metal detectors with Jamal by my side, our footsteps echoing in perfect, unbothered unison against the polished terrazzo floors. We took the elevator to the 6th floor, navigating the labyrinth of quiet, heavily guarded corridors until we reached courtroom 6B. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity. Local journalists, financial bloggers, and curious onlookers filled the heavy wooden pews, their eyes tracking our every movement as we walked down the center aisle. We took our reserved seats in the very front row, directly behind the federal prosecution table. Across the aisle, sitting in the very back row of the gallery, were Desmond and Vivian Williams. I almost did not recognize the people who had raised me. The physical transformation over the last 120 days was staggering. Vivian, a woman who used to spend thousands of dollars a week on pristine blowouts, imported dermal fillers, and custom silk gowns, looked entirely hollowed out. Her hair was dull and visibly thinning, her posture hunched, and her hands trembled uncontrollably in her lap. She wore a simple, off-the-rack black dress that hung loosely on a frame that seemed to be shrinking by the hour. Desmond sat beside her, a devastated shadow of the corporate titan he had once been. The aggressive, flushed vitality that had fueled his reign of terror was completely gone. It was replaced by the sagging gray skin of a man who had lost his empire, his vast fortune, and his freedom. He stared blankly ahead at the wooden railing, absolutely refusing to look in my direction. At the defense table at the front of the room, Trent Davis sat flanked by two exhausted public defenders. He wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that swallowed his frame. His golden boy arrogance, the smug entitlement that had defined his entire existence, was replaced by nervous, twitching panic. The federal prosecutor stood before the judge, a towering stack of digital forensic reports resting on the podium. For the next hour, she systematically outlined the sheer, unadulterated scale of Trent's embezzlement and the malicious incompetence of his cover-up. The prosecution detailed exactly how Jamal and I had dismantled his operation. When Trent first realized the federal auditors were closing in, he tried to frame Jamal by relying on outdated, poorly configured virtualization environments. The prosecution explained how Trent had deliberately manipulated the VMware ESXi management ports on the company's legacy servers, attempting to spoof Jamal's IP address and create a false trail of stolen funds. But Trent was a lazy, arrogant thief. He fundamentally misunderstood how modern secure systems operated. He did not realize that Jamal and I had built the internal auditing software for Aegis Protocol from the ground up, utilizing a strict MVVM architecture. By completely separating the user interface from the core business logic, every single piece of data Jamal touched was instantly authenticated. Furthermore, our entire operational history was securely pushed to an immutable Firebase backend structure. We had real-time, tamper-proof cryptographic tracking of our entire digital footprint. Trent's fabricated evidence fell apart under the most basic forensic scrutiny. Even the youngest student interns at my cybersecurity firm had spotted the glaring discrepancies in his digital logs within minutes. Trent had tried to bury a master architect under a pile of digital mud, and it had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own guilt with absolute mathematical certainty. Judge Harrison, a stern, unyielding man with 30 years of experience on the federal bench, adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the defense table. He did not mince words. He dismantled Trent's character with the same clinical, ruthless precision I had used to dismantle Desmond's logistics company. The judge spoke of unbridled greed. He spoke of the catastrophic damage done to hundreds of innocent warehouse employees and truck drivers who had lost their pensions when Desmond Logistics collapsed under the weight of Trent's theft. Most importantly, the judge highlighted the profound malice required to try and send an innocent man to prison simply to protect a country club lifestyle. Trent sobbed. Actual loud, pathetic sobs echoed through the quiet courtroom as he stood before the bench. He begged for leniency, citing his previous clean record, his stress, and his status as a first-time offender. He practically choked on his own tears as he asked for a reduced sentence. Judge Harrison was completely unmoved. "You did not steal out of desperation, Mr. Davis." Judge Harrison stated, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute disgust. "You stole out of a profound, arrogant sense of entitlement. You believed the rules of society did not apply to you. And when you were finally caught, you attempted to destroy the life and freedom of an innocent man, relying on vile systemic prejudices to shield your own cowardice. The court finds no grounds for leniency." The heavy wooden gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed off the high ceilings. 10 years in federal prison, maximum security, zero possibility of early parole. Trent's knees buckled. He collapsed back into his wooden chair, burying his face in his manacled hands as a low, agonizing wail escaped his throat. The two federal marshals standing behind him immediately stepped forward, pulling him up by his arms to prepare him for transport. Before adjourning the session, Judge Harrison shifted his attention away from the defense and looked directly at the prosecution table. He locked eyes with Jamal and me. "I want to formally commend Mr. and Mrs. Williams," the judge said, his tone shifting from punitive anger to profound, genuine respect. "The integrity of your digital forensics and your unwavering cooperation with federal authorities saved this court months of litigation. Mr. Jamal Williams, this court recognizes your absolute innocence. You have conducted yourself with immense dignity in the face of a highly malicious, racially motivated conspiracy. You are entirely cleared of all suspicion, and this court thanks you for your service to the truth." Jamal nodded once, a quiet, stoic acknowledgement of the vindication he had earned. He reached out and wrapped his large, warm hand around mine, lacing our fingers together tightly. The nightmare was officially, legally, and permanently over. The bailiff ordered the court to rise as Judge Harrison departed the bench. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the gallery swung open, and the spectators began to quickly file out into the corridor, eager to relay the dramatic sentencing to the waiting news vans outside. Jamal and I took our time. We gathered our coats, savoring the quiet victory humming in the air between us. As we turned to walk down the center aisle, the remaining crowd naturally parted for us. We walked with our heads held high, our steps synchronized and deliberate. And then I saw her. Standing directly in the center of the aisle, blocking my path to the exit, was Vivian. She looked incredibly frail, her shoulders trembling under the thin fabric of her cheap black dress. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen, and swimming in desperate, unshed tears. The woman who had told me I was a disappointment, who had called me socially unfit, who had actively cheered while her husband tried to put my husband in a cage, now stood before me, entirely broken. She reached out her bony, shaking fingers, grasping at the empty air between us. "Maya." She rasped, her voice a broken, pathetic wheeze that barely carried over the shuffling footsteps of the departing crowd. "Maya, please, we have nothing left." I stopped. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life ensuring I felt completely worthless. I looked at the hands that had eagerly signed away my college tuition to fund Chloe's European vacations. I looked at the mouth that had hurled racial slurs at the brilliant man holding my hand. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to cause a scene. I did not smile, and I certainly did not gloat over her destruction. I felt absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest, where a daughter's love for her mother usually lived, was completely peacefully empty. I looked right through her. I stared straight past her tear-streaked face, as if she were made of clear glass, as if she were nothing more than a trick of the light. I did not break my stride, and I did not acknowledge her existence with a single syllable. I stepped smoothly and effortlessly around her outstretched, trembling hand. I tightened my grip on Jamal's fingers, feeling the solid, unshakable reality of the family I had chosen. Together, we pushed through the heavy courthouse doors and stepped out into the bright, blinding sunlight of our new life. 6 months is a remarkably short period of time to completely redraw the skyline of your own life. Yet here we were. The warm, late summer evening air settled over the expansive glass-paneled balcony of our new custom-built home in Buckhead. I leaned against the sleek metal railing, the city of Atlanta sprawling out beneath us like a glittering, illuminated circuit board. Far below, the rush-hour traffic formed rivers of red and white light, millions of people moving mindlessly through their daily routines. Up here, it was entirely quiet. The sterile, suffocating air of the federal courthouse where I had last seen my mother was a distant, fading memory. Now I breathed in the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the crisp, clean finish of imported champagne. Jamal stood beside me, his presence a steady, comforting anchor. He rested his forearms on the railing. The tailored sleeves of his shirt rolled up his eyes, scanning the endless horizon. We had not just survived the fire my family tried to burn us in. We had harnessed it, forged our own empire from the ashes, and built an impenetrable fortress they could never breach. The corporate landscape of the city had shifted fundamentally since the day Trent Davis was handcuffed and hauled away in a federal transport van. Desmond Logistics, once a proud, towering monolith of supply chain dominance, had completely collapsed under the crushing weight of its own internal rot. When the federal authorities finally finished their exhaustive forensic audit, the company was left entirely hollow, crippled by massive debts, regulatory fines, and the devastating loss of consumer trust. That was when Aegis Protocol stepped in. We did not orchestrate a hostile takeover. We performed a necessary clinical rescue. My holding company legally absorbed the fragmented, bleeding remnants of my father's logistics empire. We swept out the toxic, compliant executives who had turned a blind eye to Trent's embezzlement to protect their own bloated bonuses. We restructured the entire operational hierarchy from the ground up, implementing rigorous, transparent oversight and bulletproof cybersecurity protocols. Most importantly, we immediately raised the wages of every single warehouse worker, dock supervisor, and long haul driver who had been cheated out of their pensions by my father's arrogance. We took a company built on ruthless exploitation and transformed it into a profitable entity driven by integrity. The irony was absolute and deeply satisfying. The exact daughter Desmond had deemed entirely unfit for the business world was now the sole architect keeping his family's original namesake from complete historical erasure. I owned the trucks. I owned the distribution centers. I owned the legacy. As for the former king and queen of Atlanta high society, their exile was absolute and unrelenting. Desmond and Vivian Williams currently resided in a cramped ground-floor two-bedroom apartment in a noisy, run-down complex out by the Perimeter Highway. Their sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate had been liquidated, the proceeds barely covering a fraction of the federal restitution and aggressive legal fees they owed. The elite social circle they had worshipped, the wealthy peers they had sacrificed my mental health to impress, completely abandoned them the very second the judge's gavel fell. There were no more exclusive country club dinners. There were no more platinum-tier charity galas or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They were untouchable pariahs, aggressively shunned by the very society they had desperately clawed their way to lead. I occasionally received mandatory updates from my legal team regarding their status. Vivian spent her days pacing the small linoleum-floored living room, obsessively refreshing society blogs and local news sites that no longer mentioned her name. Her entire identity had been tied to being perceived as superior, and without an audience to look down upon, she was simply evaporating. Desmond sat in a cheap recliner, in utter silence, a defeated, chronically angry man who finally realized his entire worth was tied to a bank account that no longer existed. They were ghosts haunting the fringes of a city they used to rule. Chloe's descent into harsh reality had been equally swift and entirely self-inflicted. Following my eviction notice on the driveway of the estate, she had actually attempted to work the entry-level data entry job I provided. That grand experiment in humility lasted exactly 14 days. She complained endlessly about the ergonomic office chairs, the strict adherence to standardized break times, and the absolute horror of having to answer to a shift supervisor who did not care about her designer handbag collection or her previous zip code. She quit in a dramatic, tearful outburst, loudly claiming the work environment was fundamentally beneath her dignity. Since that day, she had been bouncing from one reluctant friend's couch to another. With Trent serving his mandatory 10-year federal sentence and his hidden offshore assets seized by the government, Chloe had absolutely nothing left. Her fair-weather friends were quickly growing tired of funding her expensive tastes, and her options were rapidly shrinking. She had spent her entire life standing on a reinforced golden pedestal, completely neglecting to learn how to walk on solid ground. Now gravity was doing its work. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the cool, effervescent liquid ground me in the present moment. I turned my gaze away from the city and looked at Jamal. He caught my eye and smiled, a warm, genuine expression that communicated volumes without a single sound. We had built this life together, brick by brick, algorithm by algorithm, supporting each other in ways my parents could not even begin to comprehend. I leaned against the glass, reflecting on the sheer, blinding arrogance of my family. They had built their fragile, fraudulent empire directly on my back. They had looked at my quiet demeanor, my preference for writing code over attending cocktail parties, my deep desire to build systems rather than boast about them, and they had fundamentally mistaken my silence for weakness. They assumed the scapegoat would always remain docile. That was their fatal, catastrophic error. True power does not need to shout across a Thanksgiving dinner table. True power does not require a heavy, beaded silver gown, a leased luxury vehicle, or a forced, terrifying smile for the society photographers. True power moves in complete, undetectable silence. It builds diligently in the shadows, laying a structural foundation so deep and so secure that no sudden economic storm or family betrayal can uproot it. It observes human behavior, it calculates the variables, and it only strikes when the enemy has thoroughly convinced themselves they have already won. Desmond and Vivian thought they could use Jamal and me as disposable, invisible pawns to protect their stolen crown. Instead, we flipped the board, entirely executing a flawless checkmate they never saw coming. The low, rhythmic vibration of a phone broke the quiet stillness of the balcony. The device rested flat on the sleek glass patio table positioned between Jamal and me. The bright, high-resolution screen illuminated the deepening twilight, displaying a single incoming word on the caller ID. Mother. I did not reach out to frantically silence the ringer. I did not quickly swipe the screen to block the number or send the call to a full voicemail box. I simply picked up the device, feeling its smooth, cold weight in my palm. I watched the name pulse across the screen, representing decades of manipulation, conditional affection, and profound betrayal. I held my wide-rimmed crystal coupe glass of champagne out over the table. With a calm, deliberate, and entirely effortless motion of my hand, I dropped the ringing phone directly into the liquid. The heavy device sank instantly to the bottom of the glass. The bright screen flickered violently for a fraction of a second, short-circuiting and dying in a sudden rush of golden bubbles. The vibration ceased entirely. The connection was permanently severed. I left the glass sitting on the table, the dead phone resting quietly among the expensive champagne. I turned away from the table, wrapped my arms securely around my husband's waist, and rested my head against his shoulder. Together we stood on the balcony in absolute peace, feeling the warm evening breeze as we watched the sun completely set over the city I now owned. True power and self-worth are never defined by the validation of toxic family members. Maya's incredible journey teaches us that silently building our own foundation is far more potent than fighting for a seat at a table where we are disrespected. When faced with deep betrayal and entitlement, the most devastating response is not loud retaliation, but quiet, undeniable success. Blood does not guarantee loyalty. Walking away from those who exploit you is not a defeat, but the absolute ultimate victory. By protecting her peace and her empire, Maya easily proves that our chosen family and personal integrity matter most. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success, share how you reclaimed your power in the comments below.